All right, so it appears as though things have taken a turn for the worse. Now, this is typically the kind of video that I would reserve for the Prepper News channel, where it's more open-ended commentary and analysis of current events. But in light of the gravity of the current situation, I figure it's only appropriate that I address my main audience in a way that is unfiltered and freeform, just like the old days. Because I do anticipate a widespread disruption in services as a consequence of the multitude of incendiary flashpoints that we're seeing emerge around the world, geopolitically, militarily, civil unrest, economics. It's all pointing towards calamity and chaos. It's glaringly obvious at this point to anybody who is paying the faintest amount of attention. Now, I want to today just give you a cursory overview of all of the indicators that I'm seeing that are pointing towards escalation and a flare-up in hostilities in multiple theaters of war around the world, and why this is motivating me to double and triple my efforts. And I already am pretty committed to this prepping thing, so you could probably imagine what that entails. But we really are approaching a point where it's undeniable. It is blisteringly apparent that it's only a matter of days, maybe weeks at the latest, that we're going to see another war open up, whether that's with Venezuela, whether that's with Iran, whether that's with Russia and NATO. All three of these theaters, it's really a dead heat in terms of where things are going to flare up first. Because Iran backed out of well, they didn't back out. They tried to cooperate, but not to the extent that the other members of the JCPOA deemed sufficient. So now snapback sanctions have been imposed. They have pledged that they are not going to back out of the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaty, meaning that they will not openly pursue nuclear weapons. However, I don't think this is going to be sufficient for the Western coalition, and thus the casus belli for war still remains. It also appears as though there is a large military conglomeration in and around regions close to Venezuela. And in fact, at the time of making this video, we have President Trump, who has stated that they're actively preparing to do strikes inside Venezuela, which will easily escalate into a major conflict. And of course, that conflict has global geopolitical implications, because the Chinese and the Russians have a vested interest in the stability of the Maduro government, and not counting places like Panama and elsewhere across South America. However, perhaps the most important conflict in terms of its potential negative repercussions for all of mankind are, of course, the war between Russia and NATO. Now, just to give you a little bit of context as to what's been going on, if you haven't been watching the Prepper News channel, you might not be aware of the litany of negative data points, all coalescing into a giant cluster, FUCK, of chaos. So we could, of course, have a government shutdown next Tuesday at midnight if the Dems and the Republicans don't agree on certain things. And it appears as though there's a very high probability that that's going to happen. I'm not an expert on U.S. politics, and I don't know of what consequence that event in and of itself is going to have. We've had government shut down here, and it's not the end of the world. But, of course, it could complicate other things, and it could lead to greater civil disputes. It could stoke the flames of those existing civil disputes that are raging, whether they along cultural or economic lines. We all know what I'm talking about with respect to that, with the Charlie Kirk stuff. Now, this also is coinciding with a major meeting, an unprecedented meeting, never before happened. The United States, Pete Hegseth, the defense minister, the Secretary of Defense, I should say, has called a meeting of all of the top generals in the U.S. military. Admirals, generals, anybody above a one-star general is expected to attend this meeting in person at Quantico Marine Base, which is, I believe it's south of Washington. So it's very close to the Capitol. And this has a lot of people wondering, why on earth would you do this? This is a great security risk because, of course, it gives your adversaries an opportunity, perhaps a once in a millennium opportunity to take out and decapitate your entire upper echelon of your military in one fell swoop. That, of course, would be the ultimate in decapitation strikes because it's very close to Washington as well. Now, would that lead to full-scale nuclear war? Absolutely. But then we would be dependent on skeleton crews and deputies who are going to be commandeering these militaries, these various branches of the military, the U.S. military, and the various areas of responsibility. So you could see why this has people very concerned. I personally have my own theory as to what's going on here. I believe that the communication and the code potentially has been cracked, and perhaps they're actually worried that the Russians or the Chinese have some sort of intel or line of communication, or have deciphered or coded and encrypted messages to such an extent that they can't be confident that whatever they're getting prepared for has to be discussed in person in an air gap sort of way. Now, the cover story is that this is going to be some warrior ethos pep rally. I don't believe that's the case. I just can't see the risks of having a meeting like that justify putting, for the outcome, for the optics even, it just would not be worth the squeeze. It would not be worth the potential downside. And there's a lot of downside and there's not a lot of upside, unless you had to give all your top generals secret instructions on what to do because you thought that a major war, it could just be a war with Venezuela, it could just be a war with Iran, but I don't think so, because we've seen wars that would be even bigger in scope and scale than that in the past that would not have seen a summoning of all of the top generals of every various theater of responsibility. This is unparalleled in history. I don't think this has ever been done by really maybe any country, at least not out in the open as it is. So this tells us that something big is coming. That in itself, that one solitary data point, is very suspicious. Now, we've also seen a probing of multiple places across NATO, whether they be air bases, airports, various ports, critical infrastructure. This has been happening in multiple countries. Just in the past 2 weeks, we have drone sightings that have brought flights to a halt in multiple countries, including Moldova, which is having elections this weekend, which could actually be another flashpoint for hostilities in and around the Transnistria Russian exclave. We have Poland, Romania, Estonia, Sweden, France, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, of course, who have all claimed, there's a fly really pissing me off in here, who've all claimed that they have had incursions into their airspace by what I presume are quadricopter-style drones. Some of them might be other types of drones. But regardless, they have not openly incriminated Russia in these acts, but there's a lot of suspicions that it might be. And if you're the Russians and you've been probed by Ukraine, who is a proxy of NATO for the last 3 years, you've had your defenses sussed out by the reconnaissance by fire tactics of the Ukrainians. And what I mean by that is that their defense systems have been effectively triangulated every way from Sunday. So Russia is quite exposed. They now are a glass house. Every time Ukraine fires a missile or a drone into Russia, they have to intercept it, they have to expose radars, and as such, that puts them at a comparative disadvantage. And so the only way that they can level the playing field is by doing these ISR, intelligence and surveillance reconnaissance missions of their own into NATO countries. Because if it came down to a full-blown nuclear exchange, they would need to have pinpoint precision with respect to where they distributed their unconventional assets. So this is why they're probing right now, I do believe. And I, unlike a lot of people, I believe some of this is probably legitimate. There's probably a lot of false positives. There's probably a little bit of false flag in there as well, no doubt. Some people are speculating that it is Ukraine who is patching up Russian drones that they're either shooting down or bringing down through electronic warfare, patching them up and sending them into Poland and Romania to try to pin it on the Russians so that NATO will openly get involved. Maybe that's the case. Maybe NATO is in on it. Maybe they want a war with Russia and they're just looking for the reason to invoke Article 5. If any of that is true, then we need to prepare for major widespread disruptions, because that's the kind of war that can go from 0 to 100 very, very quickly, which is not to say the escalation ladder is not far more nuanced than we once thought. Myself personally, I thought at the beginning of this war that things were going to accelerate much quicker. But because of the strategic forbearance demonstrated by the Russians and their reluctance to want to destroy the world, it appears as though we had bought ourselves a bit more time. I myself have been using that time very wisely, and I hope you have too. At the start of the week, Vladimir Putin made some comments about the New START treaty and how it was set to expire. There was kind of a subtext in his message that was more ado with the fact that this really is the final treaty, which I should say is really not being enforced at all at this point in time. We don't know where Russia's mobile missile launchers are. That's why there's so much reconnaissance activity. They're trying to find these things. In such case that war does break out between East and West. We no longer have the inspection regimen that came along with this New START agreement. But I believe this was kind of a last-ditch Hail Mary and a veiled threat to NATO that things are about to go nuclear. In fact, Vladimir Putin's right-hand man, Dmitry Medvedev, did make an openly direct nuclear threat towards Ukraine and the United States this week. And this was in response to Donald Trump's mulling sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine and doing what many people are perceiving to be a complete 180. If you recall, and you go back through the Canadian Prepper archives, I've been warning people to the ire of many that Donald Trump's policy on Ukraine is not going to change one bit, or should I say the United States policy on Ukraine transcends any presidency, and that Trump, in fact, is much better suited to be the World War III president. And wouldn't you know, they've renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War. So we're really living in an Orwellian fantasy at this point in time, where the guy who rebranded the Department of Defense the Department of War is calling for the Nobel Peace Prize, whilst starting wars with Venezuela and Iran and other places. But I'm told that he's ended 7 wars. If I could find the places on a map of the places that he ended these wars, then I guess we could have something to talk about. But unfortunately, the big wars, the ones that count, have yet to be reconciled. Now, we have Orezhnik missiles confirmed now today to be moved into Belarus. Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko had a 5.5-hour meeting today, okay? A 5.5-hour meeting. That's some serious deliberation. And they came out of the meeting, and I think they said something like, oh yeah, we're going to build some nuclear power plants in, I don't know, how long is that going to take, 10 years? You don't have a 5.5-hour meeting about building nuclear power plants. They're getting ready to go to war with NATO. It's, everything is pointing towards that at this point in time. So this would explain the unusual amounts of ISR activity, the unusual amounts of aerial refueling aircraft currently flying in and around Europe, the amount of air defense identification zone incursions and interceptions, whether it be in Alaska or in the Baltics, the submarine activity that we're seeing. You're seeing explosions in the prices of gold and silver to record highs. I mean, highs that most people, you would have thought there would have been some sort of media coverage of. But unfortunately, because they don't want to panic the population, they're not calling attention to it. And then, of course, you have the teetering economic AI tech bubble that is fitting to burst at really any moment. I think the slightest breeze will likely blow it over, or the slightest pinprick, I should say, if we're being consistent with our metaphors, will burst that bubble fairly quickly. Even in the East, we have tensions with Taiwan, where all of these countries that are close to the fault lines have been distributing various types of war survival guides, civil defense survival guides. There was an altercation in somewhere in the waters in and around the Korean Peninsula, where the South Koreans fired on a North Korean ship. Fire was not reciprocated by the North Koreans, but nonetheless, tensions remain sky high in that theater as well. You have the military in the streets in the United States, so people are now acclimatized to just seeing guys around with guns in the streets and military BDUs. And then, of course, you have ICE, which is conditioning people to, even if you don't agree, or even if you do agree with the method and the policies, you also have to admit that watching your, well, I guess you wouldn't consider them to be your fellow countrymen, but just watching civilians in the street being tackled by guys with full automatics, wearing military fatigues, very paramilitary-esque in nature, sometimes even wearing, CBRN, biological nuclear gas masks. Seeing that, it's conditioning you, it's priming you to get you ready so that when you see it after a big continuity of government-style civil defense event, you will not be as shocked. It will just be an extension of what you've already seen. We have snapback sanctions being imposed on Iran, and so it's very likely that we'll see a flare-up of hostilities in Iran once again. It's simply a matter of distribution of resources. And, it seems like Zelensky has had a new refound flame, re-inflames, what can you say? He's been reinvigorated and emboldened by the support that's been given to him by Trump and NATO as of late to continue the cause to go possibly even further than Ukraine, as Trump stated. So everything is just pointing towards, a major flare-up at some point in time. It's just simply a matter of where and when. And it's important to understand, if you're new to this channel, that the stuff you're hearing about in the media, that's not the real news, okay? The real stuff that moves geopolitical decisions happens in the back channels. And that is why you have open source intelligence aggregators in order to try to decipher what is actually happening, either on the back channels. And it's difficult because in order to stay a step ahead, you have to be very informed, and you have to a degree, speculate a little bit about what the potential outcomes might be. Now, in terms of this meeting that is coming up next week, we're going to find out what it's really all about. But just remember that there's going to be a public face component to this, where they're going to say that it's a pep rally and they're going to do a little photo op. But I would be more interested in what is happening after hours or before that event, because I have a sneaking suspicion that what this is really about is making sure that everybody is on the same page, everybody knows the game plan, because you would only hold a meeting like this if you knew that there was a major world upending event that was about to happen. I mean, let's get real. You're not calling back all of your top generals, and they're going to play this down, and you're going to see Trump playing the fiddle as Rome burns at these football games and acting as though this is just business as usual, but there's nothing typical about this meeting. This is incredibly concerning, and in fact, this is what put me over the edge to want to make this video. Now, that is just scratching the surface of everything that is pointing towards disaster on multiple fronts. And you may not think it affects you because it's happening overseas. Well, it's getting closer to us with Venezuela. And the global supply chain is very sensitive to even the slightest disruption. We've seen what happened with the Suez Canal when the shipping container turned on its side. We've seen what happened in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait when Yemen had their blockade. And so all of these potential choke points can cause widespread disruptions. Some are going to be more severe than others. What concerns me right now is this attempt to existentially, economically defeat Russia and what the implications are going to be. because that war, I think the United States believes that it will be contained to Europe. But I don't think it's going to be contained in the way they think. Because, of course, they are the benefactors of Europe. They're the ones who are supplying Europe with the majority of the weapons that they would use to fight the Russians. And, of course, under their NATO Article 5 obligations, they are obliged, but not required, to come to the aid of their adversaries, which, of course, would have some nuclear reprisal for us over here in North America. So I would strongly encourage people to seize on this opportunity, even if it is just a consequence of tariffs. And that reminds me, Jase Medical is probably going to be raising their prices soon because of potential tariffs on, not potential, of pharmaceutical tariffs. So if you want emergency antibiotics, if you want to get extra supplies of your prescription medications, you can do so through the link in the description below. It definitely helps support the channel. And just keep on doing what you're doing, keep on staying healthy. And I guess at this point in time, I would say make amends with those family members who, for whatever reason, maybe, you diverged and maybe there's some sort of enmity between you. I think you should resolve that, because when it comes down to the wire, you're going to need as much of your phenol ties as possible to see yourself through a major disaster. And please go and check out some of our other videos on this channel. Maybe you'll learn a thing or two. Thanks for watching, my friends. Take care. Canadian Prepper out.